For decades, when people talked about missile technology, three names came up: the United States, Russia, and China. India wasn't part of that conversation. Indian weapons were seen as good enough for India's own army, but never good enough to sell to the world. China, in particular, watched India's defense industry with quiet dismissal. Many analysts, including those in China, viewed India's defense industry as a domestic player rather than a future exporter. Then, one small Southeast Asian country changed everything, and China has been watching very closely ever since. For most of India's history, its defense industry had a reputation problem. After independence, India relied heavily on imported weapons: Soviet tanks, British aircraft, Russian air defense systems. Its own state-run defense research organization, the DRDO, built a reputation for projects that were delayed, over budget, or simply never delivered. Foreign buyers looked elsewhere. Russia had legacy trust built over decades of Cold War partnerships. The US had cutting-edge technology and a vast global sales network. China had scale and rock-bottom prices for developing nations. India lacked that reputation as a global defense exporter. Even India's most advanced weapon, a supersonic cruise missile called BrahMos, started life looking like just another ambitious but uncertain project. It was developed as a joint venture between India's DRDO and Russia's NPO Mashinostroyenia, established in 1998. Its name itself is a fusion of two rivers, the Brahmaputra in India and the Moskva in Russia, symbolizing the partnership behind it. The missile completed its first test flight in 2001, and for years afterward, it remained something India built almost entirely for itself. Deployed along tense borders but never sold abroad. Analysts in Beijing and elsewhere assumed India would remain a buyer of foreign weapons, not a seller of its own. That assumption didn't survive contact with the South China Sea. In January 2022, the Philippines signed a $375 million deal with India for 3 batteries of the BrahMos shore-based anti-ship missile system, becoming the first export customer in the missile's history after decades of only domestic use. This wasn't a symbolic order. BrahMos is one of the fastest cruise missiles in the world, flying at close to 3 times the speed of sound, with a range of around 290 kilometers. It can be launched from land, sea, air, or even submarines, and operates on a fire-and-forget principle, meaning once launched, it needs no further guidance to hit its target. For a country trying to defend its coastline against a much larger neighbor, that combination of speed, range, and precision mattered enormously. The first battery arrived in April 2024, flown in aboard an Indian Air Force transport aircraft. A second battery followed in April 2025. A third was scheduled for early 2026, completing a full coastal missile regiment for the Philippine Marine Corps. These weren't stored in a warehouse somewhere. They were deployed to Zambales, on the western coast of Luzon, positioned to cover waters near Scarborough Shoal, one of the most contested locations in the entire South China Sea, and a frequent flashpoint between Manila and Beijing. For the first time, a Southeast Asian country facing pressure from China had a credible, long-range strike system. And it didn't come from Washington or Moscow. It came from New Delhi. Here's where the story gets interesting. In April 2026, the Philippines didn't just quietly operate these missiles. They showcased the BrahMos system publicly during Balikatan, the largest joint military exercise between the Philippines, the United States, and allied nations, with over 17,000 troops participating. The system was activated in a simulation firing mode, integrated directly into war games explicitly designed to defend against regional threats. The message wasn't subtle. An Indian-made weapon, operating alongside American forces, aimed at deterring Chinese pressure in waters China claims almost entirely for itself. And it didn't stop there. India's missile export success didn't remain a one-country story. In May 2026, India's defense secretary confirmed that Vietnam had signed a $629 million deal for 6 BrahMos batteries. A country with its own long and bitter history of conflict with China. Indonesia had already finalized its own agreement for a battery back in March. India's defense officials also indicated that Thailand and Malaysia were exploring similar deals. What started as a single $375 million contract with the Philippines was turning into a growing web of coastal defense systems across Southeast Asia, every one of them built in India. For a defense industry once dismissed as a domestic-only player, that's an extraordinary reversal. This matters for a reason that goes beyond one missile system. Affordable, land-based anti-ship missiles are changing the economics of naval power in the region. A missile battery costing a fraction of a warship can now threaten vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Small and mid-sized countries no longer need massive navies to raise the cost of aggression. They need precision and range, and BrahMos gives them both. There's also a broader shift happening here. For most of the last century, defense exports followed a familiar pattern. Major powers sold weapons to smaller nations, largely on their own terms. What's happening in Southeast Asia looks different. A group of small and mid-sized countries, most of them with direct territorial disputes with China, are independently choosing the same supplier, not because they were pressured into it, but because the system fits their specific defense needs and their budgets. That's not something Washington or Moscow orchestrated. It's a market decision, made country by country. It's also worth being clear about the limits here. India isn't replacing the US or Russia as a dominant global arms exporter overnight. Its defense export industry is still growing, and BrahMos remains its flagship success story rather than proof of broad dominance. Production capacity is limited, and India still relies on Russian components for parts of the missile's propulsion system. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. From a country that couldn't sell weapons abroad, to a country whose missiles are now shaping the balance of power in one of the most contested waterways on Earth. A decade ago, the idea of Indian missiles deterring Chinese ships in the South China Sea would have sounded far-fetched. Today, it's operational reality on the coast of Luzon, and it's spreading to Vietnam, Indonesia, and potentially beyond. China watched India's defense industry for years and saw little to worry about. Now it watches a growing network of Indian-made missiles spreading across Southeast Asia, and there's no sign that network is done growing. If you want to understand the technologies and mega projects reshaping India's place in the world, subscribe, because this story is only getting started.